Ancient Jewish cultures related to women, to women's bodies, and to women's power in a variety of ways. In different times and places, Jews conceived of gender in diverging ways. Women occupied a variety of social roles and experienced a range of different constraints on their freedoms and power. Depictions of women's clothing offer a view into the ways ancient Jews thought about women's bodies. This presentation focuses on clothing, bodies, and power, ancient Jewish women unveiled. Anxiety about women's power and sexualities is a feature of many ancient cultures. This presentation will examine the different ways different Jewish cultures imagined the virtue, power, and bodies of women at three different civilizational moments. First, we'll focus on the Book of Judith, which comes from the land of Israel in the 2nd century BCE from the Hasmonean period. Then we'll look at Dora Europa's synagogue, and we'll conclude with a passage from the classical Palestinian Midrash, Genesis Rabbah. So now to the Book of Judith. In case you don't know the amazing story of Judith, it's a story full of violence and sex. And to make a long story short, things end when Judith saves her city and her people from a siege from a foreign power by first seducing the general Holofernes and then, in a moment of vulnerability, chopping his head off. But my focus today is going to be on the different ways that the Book of Judith, again, a book from the Apocrypha from the Hasmonean period, how this book focuses on women's clothes. When Judith is first introduced into the story, we read, Judith remained as a widow for 3 years and 4 months at home, where she put up a tent for herself on the roof of her house. She put sackcloth around her waist and dressed in widow's clothing. She fasted all the days of her widowhood, except the day before the Sabbath and the Sabbath itself, etc., etc., etc. What I want you to notice here is how Judith's extreme piety is expressed through the clothing she wears. And to emphasize this theme of clothing, we find that as the story continues and Judith plans and plots to defeat her enemies, clothing plays an important role in her ability to effect change. So after Judith prayed for God's help, she rose from where she lay prostrate. She called her maid and went down into the house where she lived on Sabbaths and on her festal days, as opposed to the tent where she lived the rest of the time. She removed the sackcloth she had been wearing, took off her widow's garments, bathed her body with water, and anointed herself with precious ointment. She combed her hair, put on a tiara, and dressed herself in the festive attire that she used to wear while her husband Manasseh was living. She put sandals on her feet and put her anklets, bracelets, rings, earrings, and all her other jewelry on. Thus she made herself very beautiful to entice the eyes of all the men who might see her. And just in case we might miss this very important theme of clothing in the Book of Judith, look at how Judith's prayer rereads the Genesis story of the rape of Dinah, shifting the emphasis from the violence to Dinah and then the violence to the family of Shem, to this issue of clothing. O Lord of my ancestor Simeon, Judith prays, to whom you gave a sword to take revenge on those strangers who had torn off a virgin's clothing to defile her, and exposed her thighs to put her to shame, and polluted her womb to disgrace her, for you said it shall not be done, yet they did it. So you gave up their rulers to be killed, and their bed, which was ashamed of the deceit that they had practiced, was stained with blood. And of course, this is a foreshadowing of what happens in Judith's tale as she bathes the blood of the evil general Holofernes with blood when she cuts off his head. So what's striking to me about the Book of Judith is, even as this book from the Hasmonean period imagines something like a female Judah Maccabee, a strong, valiant woman who is full of virtue, it celebrates a woman's power by both sexualizing her body and making her power one of extreme violence. With that, I'd like to turn to a second snapshot from Jewish civilization, a very, very different depiction of women's power and women's clothing. The Dora Europos synagogue is from Syria. The synagogue was painted in the 3rd century CE. You'll remember that this is a synagogue in a community that's on the border between the Roman Empire to the west and the Sasanian Persian Empire to the east. And you'll remember that in one famous panel from the synagogue, we saw the different cultures represented. We saw Persian clothing, and we also saw Roman clothing coming together in this image from the story of Esther. One thing that's delightful about this picture is that we have a glimpse of Esther in full Persian garb, depicted as a woman in a harem with a veil. She's in the right-hand side of this panel. But the picture that I really want to focus on right now is a picture that depicts scenes from the infancy of Moses. And what's terrifically striking to me about this image is the plethora of female figures that are portrayed on the wall of the synagogue. So let me just quickly give a recap of what's happening in this image. On the right-hand side, you have Pharaoh and 2 of his servants. And it's striking to me that Pharaoh here is dressed in Persian garb. That's perhaps a little dig at the Persian Empire, which you'll remember is an enemy empire and is the imperial power that's probably most threatening to the people of Dora Europos when this art is being produced. So we're going to read the image from right to left, the way Hebrew reads from right to left. So in the next panel, you see 2 women. Note that their heads are covered, which might be a sign of piety or modesty. Their clothing is very drapey. They're almost like saris. And also in that panel, we see a woman bending down to perhaps to place a baby in the water, or perhaps there's something else. We don't have the full image, so perhaps something is missing. But I'm guessing that this is a depiction of the 2 midwives who receive Pharaoh's decree. But move over to the next scene in this picture, and we have a striking image. In the Nile is the daughter of Pharaoh, and she's naked, exactly as we would expect. This is a realistic depiction of how one might bathe in the Nile, but still it is very striking to have a picture of a nude woman on the wall of a synagogue. And you'll notice that behind the daughter of Pharaoh are 3 attendants. They're dressed differently than the Hebrew midwives in the other panels, but their heads are also covered. And the daughter of Pharaoh, of course, is holding the infant Moses. And then in the final scene, we see that little Moses has been passed along to 2 women who look an awful lot like those 2 midwives, but who are likely Yocheved, the birth mother of Moses, and Moses' sister Miriam. So this is the panel that I wanted to focus on. And this panel is striking, as I said, because of all of these plethora of images. Here, women's strength and power to make a difference comes through in a strong way. But unlike in the story of Judith, here, women's interventions are life-saving. They're associated with birth and healing rather than with violence and killing. Now, it raises some questions about the realia of this time. Does the panel depict how contemporary women actually dressed, Or is this how the artist imagines the biblical women of the past looked? In any case, the inclusion of a nude female figure on the wall of the synagogue indicates that, unlike the culture that produced the Book of Judith, this is not a culture in which women's bodies are feared, despised, or sexualized. But now I want to jump to another moment from Jewish civilization. We're going to go back to the land of Israel, but we're jumping forward in time. As we look to Genesis Rabbah, we're looking to a text that is thought to be edited in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. And the texts from Genesis Rabbah that I want to focus on are texts that engage the story of Eve's creation. Of course, Genesis Rabbah, like Midrash generally and like rabbinic literature, is multivocal, conveying a diversity of outlooks and attitudes about everything, but especially on women and on gender. But in this section of the Midrash, the biblical story of Eve's creation provides a hook for some of the most virulent expressions of misogyny in rabbinic literature. Here, as this section of Genesis Rabbah 18 opens, it opens with a debate, which is framed almost like a war between the sexes. Who's better, men or women? The hook, as I said, is this verse about the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. The verb in Hebrew is vayiven. And so this midrash and other passages that follow turn on creative plays, word plays with that word vayiven. Rabbi Eliezer said, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Zimra, woman was endowed with more understanding, bina, than man. In this reworking of the biblical verse, vayiven means that God implanted understanding in the woman that he created. But Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, there are those that say the opposite, as the way of a woman is to sit in her home and the way of a man is to go out to the marketplace and learn understanding from others. So it is striking that women here are disparaged by Rabbi Yirmiyah for lacking the worldly wisdom that men gain from being out in the world, when it is probably those men who are responsible for restricting women's movement. In any case, please note that other rabbinic sources depict marketplaces as spheres where women are out and about and active. But I want to jump ahead to an excerpt that comes from a little bit later in this midrash, where Rabbi Yoshua of Sichmin said, in the name of Rabbi Levi, Vayiven is written, he contemplated heat bonin, from where to create her. He said, I will not create her from the head, lest she be haughty. I will not create her from the eye, lest she be coquettish. I will not create her from the ear, lest she be an eavesdropper. I will not create her from the mouth, lest she be a chatterbox. I will not create her from the heart, lest she be jealous. I will not create her from the hand, lest she be a thief. I will not create her from the leg, lest she be a runabout. Rather, I will create her from the most modest place on a person, as even when a person stands naked, this place, the rib, is covered. And as he created each and every limb of the woman, he would say to her, be a modest woman, be a modest woman. Nevertheless, quote, and they have disregarded all of my counsel. What this adds up to is a big disparagement of women who are accused of not being in the least bit modest, despite God's every effort. This passage portrays women's bodies as sites of danger and immorality. The Midrash atomizes the female body, reducing women to an amalgam of body parts. But it does seem like the Darshan is really interested in all of those body parts, even as he degrades women from head to toe. Even as this teaching denigrates women, it conveys deep anxiety about women's sexuality and power. Unlike the Book of Judith, it denies women any claims to virtue or to the possibility of public action. So I'd like to close by returning to this picture that celebrates women's power and depicts women in beautiful clothing and in beautiful nakedness. I hope this presentation can serve as a model for your own presentations. Good luck with the research.